There's an ancient principle in international economics. You can control the world's money, or you can rely on real assets, but you cannot do both indefinitely. For 52 years, since 1971, the United States defied that fundamental rule. They printed dollars backed by nothing more than trust and military threats. But this week, something changed. The People's Bank of China reported 2,264 tons of gold in its official reserves. Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, called emergency meetings with the Treasury Department. The number that terrified Washington wasn't the reported 2,264 tons. It was the estimates from analysts like Genuine Hoage suggesting that China holds between 4,000 and 6,000 tons of undeclared gold in strategic reserves. That represents $420 billion in purchasing power that the United States cannot control, cannot confiscate, and cannot devalue with a press release. I worked at the International Monetary Fund for years. I've seen this pattern before. When a monetary empire starts accumulating adversaries who buy physical assets instead of its bonds, the clock starts ticking. And this week, that clock is reading 11:58. What corporate media doesn't want you to know is this: China is not buying gold for diversification. They're building an ark before the flood. They're preparing for the day when the US dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency. And every ounce of gold Beijing accumulates is a vote of no confidence in the system Washington built at Bretton Woods 80 years ago. This isn't theory. This is happening now. And what you're going to witness over the next 17 minutes is the analysis global financial institutions are discussing privately but will never admit publicly. Let's start with something you need to understand clearly. The United States has not treated China as a trade partner. It has treated it as an existential threat from the moment its economy began to compete. In 2018, the Trump administration imposed 25% tariffs on $250 billion of Chinese goods. That wasn't a trade dispute. It was an attempt to kneecap Chinese manufacturing. In 2019, the US blacklisted Huawei, destroying $30 billion in market value overnight. Huawei's crime was building 5G technology superior to America's. In 2020, Washington forced the sale of TikTok under threat of a total ban, claiming national security without presenting evidence. In 2022, the CHIPS and Science Act banned U.S. firms from selling advanced semiconductors to China. That was a $400 billion blow to China's tech industry. And in 2023, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen publicly warned European banks they would face secondary sanctions if they continued processing yuan payments for Chinese companies. This isn't competition. This is full-scale economic warfare. But here's the delicious irony Washington didn't anticipate. Every sanction, every tariff, every tech ban sent the same message to Beijing. You cannot trust the dollar. You cannot trust our financial system. You need an alternative. And China heard that message loud and clear. In 2013, China's gold reserves were roughly 1,054 tons. By 2019, they had risen to 1,948 tons. And now, in December 2024, they officially report 2,264 tons. That's a 115% increase in 11 years. But here's what the official reports don't tell you. The World Gold Council estimates China imported more than 5,000 tons of gold in the last decade through Hong Kong, London, and Switzerland. Where did all that gold go? It didn't magically turn into consumer jewelry. It's in undeclared state vaults. It's in strategic reserves Beijing keeps off the IMF's books. Why? Because the day China declares its true gold holdings is the day the world officially recognizes that the dollar has a competitor backed by real assets. And they're not alone. Russia bought 456 tons of gold between 2018 and 2022, bringing its reserves to 2,332 tons. India added 200 tons in 2023 alone. Poland, Turkey, Uzbekistan, every central bank that distrusts dollar hegemony is buying gold at record speed. The year 2023 saw the largest central bank gold purchase in 55 years, 1,136 tons. And 2024 is on track to beat it. This isn't coincidence. This is coordination. So what happened? What specific event this week put the Federal Reserve into panic mode? On December 18th, 2024, The People's Bank of China announced it would continue buying gold aggressively in 2025 to protect national wealth from dollar volatility. That official statement, those exact words, protect from dollar volatility, was a direct slap in the face to the US Treasury. It was Beijing publicly saying, "Your currency is unstable. We no longer trust it. We're leaving." And that same day, Saudi Arabia announced it would accept Chinese yuan for oil exports, not as a marginal option, as a primary payment mechanism for contracts with China. That's potentially $180 billion annually in oil trade that no longer requires dollars. The petrodollar, the backbone of U.S. power since 1974, just took a mortal blow. Now let me explain why Jerome Powell is terrified. For 52 years, the United States had a magic trick. It could print money without limit because the world needed dollars to buy oil. You needed dollars for international trade. You needed dollars for bank reserves. That created infinite artificial demand for a currency Washington could create with a keystroke. It was the biggest Ponzi scheme in history, except it was legal because they had the military power to enforce it. But when China buys gold and Saudi Arabia accepts yuan, that magic trick breaks. Suddenly, there's less demand for dollars. And when there's less demand but the same supply, or worse, growing supply because the Fed keeps printing, what happens? Inflation, devaluation, collapse of purchasing power. The U.S. national debt is currently $34.8 trillion. Interest payments alone in 2024 totaled $892 billion, more than the defense budget. And with interest rates at 5.5%, those payments will rise to $1.2 trillion annually in 2025. Who buys the treasuries that finance that debt? Traditionally China and Japan. But in 2024, China cut its treasury holdings from $1.1 trillion to $778 billion. Japan reduced from $1.2 trillion to $1.08 trillion. They're selling, they're exiting, and they're using those dollars to buy gold. So who buys U.S. debt now? The Federal Reserve itself. That's called debt monetization. It is the technical definition of printing money out of thin air. And every serious economist knows how that ends, in hyperinflation or a collapse of confidence. Scott Bessent, the newly appointed Treasury Secretary, faces an impossible nightmare. He needs to sell $7.6 trillion in new debt in 2025 just to refinance maturing bonds and fund the budget deficit. But traditional buyers are fleeing, and you can't declare war on your own banker. You can't sanction China for not buying your debt when you desperately need them to buy it. It is the most humiliating geopolitical predicament imaginable. The empire must beg its adversaries to finance its survival. Here I want to mention John Mearsheimer, professor of political science at the University of Chicago and one of the most respected international relations theorists of our era. For decades, Mearsheimer has argued that U.S. hegemony is not indefinitely sustainable. In his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, he explains that every empire eventually faces the dilemma of overextension. You spend so much maintaining the empire that you become economically vulnerable, and your competitors exploit that vulnerability exactly as China is doing now. Mearsheimer predicted in 2014 that China would challenge the US-led international order not through direct military confrontation, but through patient economic accumulation and the building of alternative institutions. That is precisely what we are witnessing. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, launched in 2016, now has 109 member countries. China's cross-border interbank payment system processes $12.7 trillion annually, up 80% since 2020. Each of these institutions is a pipeline draining power from the US-dominated system. Kenneth Rogoff, former IMF chief economist, wrote in October 2024 that central bank gold accumulation is the most reliable indicator of distrust in the existing monetary system. And Carmen Reinhart, also formerly of the IMF, warned that when reserve empires collapse, they collapse faster than anyone expects because the shift is nonlinear. These are not fringe voices. These are the architects of the very system now being dismantled. What we're witnessing is not the beginning of a transition. The transition has already happened. The world just hasn't realized it yet. Here is the systemic reality that must be clearly understood. The The global economic order since 1971 has rested on two fundamental pillars: the petrodollar and U.S. Treasuries as the ultimate risk-free asset. China just blew up both pillars simultaneously. First pillar, the petrodollar. In 1974, the U.S. struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would sell oil only in dollars, and the U.S. would provide military protection. That forced every country on Earth to hold dollar reserves to buy energy, instant artificial demand for the U.S. currency. But in 2023, Saudi Arabia didn't renew the exclusive petrodollar agreement. And in December 2024, they're accepting yuan. Pillar 1 is collapsing. Second pillar, treasuries as risk-free. For decades, economic theory treated U.S. bonds as mathematically default-proof. But when China sells $320 billion in treasuries in 24 months and replaces them with gold, they're saying the risk is no longer zero. In fact, it is unacceptably high. And when the world's largest creditor says that, markets eventually listen. Now here is what will replace those pillars. BRICS has just expanded to 11 countries representing 45% of the world's population and 35% of global GDP. They're building an alternative payment system that bypasses SWIFT. They're trading in local currencies backed by gold. Russia already sells gas to China in yuan. India buys Russian oil in rupees. Brazil and China trade directly without dollars. Each of these bilateral deals is another nail in Bretton Woods' coffin. And the genius is they don't need to overthrow the dollar globally. They only need to create enough options so countries can operate outside the U.S. system. Once that optionality exists, the United States loses its most powerful weapon, the ability to sanction countries by cutting them off from the global financial system. Ask Russia how that worked. Washington cut them off from SWIFT in 2022. Russia simply shifted to alternative payment systems, and its economy grew 3.6% in 2024. The weapon misfired. So what does this mean for Washington in concrete terms? It means Janet Yellen can no longer imperial liquidation phase. Every empire in history has faced this moment, when the cost of maintaining the empire exceeds the benefits of owning it. Rome faced it in the 4th century, Spain in the 17th, Britain in 1945, and the United States faces it now in 2024. The only question is whether the transition will be orderly or chaotic. And based on how Washington is responding, more sanctions, more threats, more aggressive posturing, the answer looks chaotic. Are you enjoying this analysis? If this content is opening your eyes to what's really happening behind corporate headlines, please hit the subscribe button right now. Join the thousands waking up to the geopolitical reality traditional media won't dare cover. And if this video is providing value, hit like so more people can find this information. It really helps the algorithm spread truth instead of propaganda. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? Mexico? Spain? Argentina? I'd love to know where our community is as we witness this historic moment together. Now let's talk about what this means for you personally. Not for China, not for the Federal Reserve, for your wallet, your savings, your economic future. When the dollar loses reserve currency status, it doesn't happen as a binary event. It happens gradually, then suddenly. And during the gradual phase, you experience persistent inflation. Groceries cost 30% more than 3 years ago. Gas rises 45%. Rent, if you can find it, becomes unreachable. Wages don't keep up. This isn't theory. It's already happening in 2024. But the second phase, the suddenly phase, is when the world collectively realizes the dollar is no longer a safe haven. When that happens, you see capital flight. Foreign investors dumping U.S. assets. Bond market collapses. And the government faces two impossible choices: default on the debt or print money to pay it. History tells us they always choose printing. They always choose inflation over default, which means your savings, your pensions, everything denominated in dollars will lose purchasing power massively. In the 1970s, when the dollar devalued after Nixon abandoned the gold standard, The average American saw purchasing power fall 40% in a decade. And that was when the US was still the world's dominant manufacturer. Now, with manufacturing in Asia, record debt, and adversaries building alternative systems, the devaluation could be far worse. Some economists estimate a 60 to 70% loss of purchasing power over the next 15 years. That means your $100,000 in savings becomes $30,000 in terms of what it can actually buy. But here's the hopeful side I don't want you to miss. A multipolar world, a world where no single country can weaponize the financial system against others, is potentially a more stable world. When trade happens in multiple currencies, when gold backs reserves, when no empire can print money infinitely, you get discipline. You get real consequences for irresponsible spending. And smaller countries get options. They're no longer hostages to Washington or Beijing. They can choose partners based on mutual benefit, not coercion. Venezuela, for example, is selling oil to China in yuan and using those yuan to buy Russian products, bypassing the dollar entirely. Is it perfect? No. But does it give them sovereignty they didn't have before? Absolutely. And that's the promise of the emerging order. More options, less empire, more balance. What you need to understand is this. The gold China is accumulating isn't just an investment. It's a vote. A vote for real assets over paper promises. A vote for sovereignty over submission. A vote for a system where value is backed by something tangible, not just military power. And every ounce they buy, every yuan transaction Saudi Arabia accepts, every BRICS nation joining the alternative system, each one is another vote in the same direction. We are witnessing a global decision in real time, and the results are already coming in. The order built at Bretton Woods in 1944, dominated by the US dollar, is being replaced by something different, something more decentralized, something where power is distributed instead of concentrated. Stay alert. Stay informed. Watch who is buying gold. Watch who is selling treasuries. Watch which countries are trading in local currencies. Those are your indicators. Those are the data points that matter more than any news headline. And remember this, empires don't announce their end. They simply stop being able to enforce their rules. And when you see Washington begging China to buy debt, when you see Jerome Powell panicking over gold accumulation, when you see the petrodollar dying in real time, what you are witnessing is not the beginning of the end. It is the end that has already begun. You are witnessing the foundations of the world order being reorganized. And the question isn't whether it will change. The question is whether you'll be prepared when it does.